And so we have 3 generations represented in this room. So it's really, really special. So I know that you will give a warm welcome to Galit Prince Hedaya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I have to give a shout out to my family and to the board that's all here. I really appreciate all the support. This is my mom, Bati. She and I both did the DOOR program together. And my mom just came back actually from March of the Living. So she was there, she saw a lot of this stuff, and I just wanted her to hop in and jump in at any moment as we start sharing my grandmother's story. My name is Galit Prince, and I'm really just so honored to be here on behalf of the museum. The museum, as Jen mentioned, was founded in 1961 by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to honor those that perished and commemorate their stories and have a place to hold their artifacts. I remember coming here in 2010. So this building, I remember 2009 when this building was during construction. And my grandmother used to say, you have to be involved. This is going to be our home. I feel so connected to this place. You have to be involved. It wasn't a choice. She forced me to do it. But as I got older, I realized it was such an honor for me to be part of this organization. I'm on the board of the museum. I'm on the 3rd generation board of the museum. I'm a docent, and I did the DOOR program. So I feel super connected. I feel like I'm taking on her legacy. And to be honest, when my grandmother was alive, my role was to put events together for her to speak. Literally, that's all I did. I was like, I don't have to do anything. I'm just going to get people to show up. And that's all I did. And when she passed away in 2017, I then realized, oh my God, I have to do this. I have to prepare myself to share her story. Because I realized if it's not for me or my mom or anyone else in my family, it won't live. And so I take great honor in sharing her story, sometimes unwillingly, but she encouraged me and forced me to do it. And I now take that with great honor. At the time, it was challenging, but I'm very happy that I'm here and I'm doing it. So this is my grandmother, Ester Tepper. I think she's about 4 or 5 in this photo. And this is a photo of her during Purim as Queen Esther. I want to start off this presentation with, as I said, I did an event with it was important for me to do events. The last event I did with her was 6 weeks before she passed away with FIDF and the Holocaust Museum. And I just want to show you a little clip of that video. I just want you to get the sense of my grandmother and who she was and how beautiful she was. So I'm going to play that for you.
Not far away. I'm 40 years in America. I was 7 years old when the war began. 7. A little small girl like this. I didn't know to write, not to read. About 6 years I was in the Holocaust. 6 years. From 7 to 13 when I was liberated. And then 1939, all of a sudden the bomb began to fly all over the city. Yes, I was 2 years in the ghetto. They're going to liquidate the ghetto. Everybody who will be in the ghetto will be killed. So my father ran to his friends and bought papers as Christian. They killed my brother who was 16 years old in the ghetto, my mom and all my family, grandparents, parents, uncles, cousins, everybody went to Treblinka. I was liberated in 45 in Vienna, and then we ran in some way to Palestine. We want to come to Palestine.
So that's my grandmother, Esther. This is a photo. So I want to first off by saying that my family is very lucky. We have lots of photos. We have hundreds of photos. Most people don't have any photos from pre-war. You'll see in this presentation I have during the war. So part of that is because my grandmother's father, Zelig, was an artist photographer. And he had a studio in their house, and he had a studio in the town square. And he was really well known and recognized in the community. So we have hundreds of photos. So these are all original. These are of my grandmother and her family. So this is my grandmother's mom, Ghetto. This is her older brother, Menachem, her sister, Chana, and this is my grandmother, Esther. They were a normal family. This was a normal life. This is just a photo of the family. This is a photo of my grandmother with her siblings, with the dog. This was just life pre-war, just like a typical photo of the family. They were from a town called Radomsko, and it's midway between Warsaw, the capital, and Krakow. At the time, in the early 1930s, this town had approximately 30,000 people. 1/3 of them were Jewish. So 1 out of every 3 people was someone who was Jewish. They were fully assimilated. The Jews and the Catholics were fully assimilated. It was not uncommon to have Catholic friends. It was a city that was, it was a vibrant city. It had industries, it had a library, it had 2 movie theaters. I guess back then that was a big deal to have a movie theater in your town. And it was intellectual. It was an intellectual town. So, I don't think my grandmother's family ever thought anything would happen. They were fully assimilated in Poland, in a thriving city. I find this super interesting. So during that time, it's really hard to see on this little map, but I have on the side over here, there weren't very many Jews in Europe. I mean, it's quite shocking. It wasn't like there was half of the European population was Jewish. It's so little. Poland had the largest at about 10%, but Germany, for example, had less than 1% of its population was Jewish. I mean, if you just think about that, like think about the Holocaust and the destruction and how many people were actually living in Europe at that time. So I personally just find this quite fascinating and, kind of crazy to take in. So here's a picture of Radomsko. As you can see, like normal life, people in the town, people in the square, like just living their life. And here's a photo of my grandmother with her 2 siblings. She used to talk about how idyllic her life was. She was like, I had a normal childhood. She was really young. So when she used to share like her stories, she really connected to her childhood. That's all she had, like up until 7 years old. So she would say, like, we used to play in the park. We used to play on our lawn. She's like, my grandfather was very musical, so they had a violin in the house and a piano. And my grandmother, which you'll start to see, she has piercing blue eyes, and she looked like Shirley Temple, they used to say. She used to like perform. He'd be like, go perform for us and sing and dance, like while I'm playing the piano or the violin. So she had a really normal, idyllic life. And her father, like I said, would take so many photos. So this is actually not an original. This is just something that I found, but I just wanted to include it to show like what was Radomsko then. And my mom went back, and actually like a lot of the town still looks the same. They didn't bomb it. They didn't destruct it. So a lot of the original buildings actually are still there. So this was interesting. During our research, we found a letter, which is in Yiddish, and it's from my grandmother's aunt, Gittel's sister, who wrote several letters saying, please leave Poland and come to us in Palestine. She was sent off to Palestine to meet a husband, which was, I guess, normal at that time. And she was hearing what was happening and sent numerous letters. And Zelig didn't want to leave. He was like, we're fully assimilated. My grandmother spoke Polish. She didn't speak Yiddish in the house. They were like, I'm fully integrated in the community. I have my photography studio. So he wasn't going anywhere. This actual letter was sent, but they never received it. Because at that point, 1 month, they'd already been in the ghetto. So they actually never received this actual letter, but they had received other letters. So in 1939, I remember my grandmother explaining this. She said all of a sudden there were bombs. She didn't know what was happening. She ran to her parents, and within one day, the Nazis just came in and took over the town. And here's a photo, not original, but here's a photo of what that looked like. Just one day, just taking over everything. And they were placed a couple blocks away from their childhood home in a ghetto. So a ghetto, for those of you that don't know, is an enclosed district that separated the Jews from the non-Jews. It was part of the process of the dehumanization process of the Jews, of treating them not like humans, putting them in like a cage. We don't put people in cages, but separating them. They weren't the same as others. And that was sort of the process of the Holocaust, of just making Jewish people feel less than. They were subhuman. And putting them in ghettos was part of that. They weren't sanitary, they didn't have food, they didn't have clothes, they didn't have things that they needed to, they didn't have soap. What does that make you feel? Not even having soap to take care of yourself, right? You start to feel less than human. And that was part of the process and the goal of the Nazis. And, here's just a photo of what the exterior of a ghetto looked like, using wires and barbed wires. So, by the way, Mom, if at any point you want to add anything, let me know. So this is a photo of my grandmother and her parents inside the ghetto. Again, we're super fortunate to even have this. I look at my grandmother and she's smiling, and she's thin. My grandmother was always had a little extra meat on the bones. And I look at this photo and it's clear that she's not eating, right? She looks very thin. And I really think that this was an act of resistance, spiritual resistance. I think this is part of her father being here is some normalcy. Let's take photos as we used to. Let's sort of keep who we are and not let the Nazis take everything away from us. And so I think that was part of that. And also I was trained by my grandmother, when you get in front of the camera, you smile and you show your teeth. This is what she's doing. You know what I mean? I think she's actually deep inside. I can't imagine her being at all happy, but I know that that's what she was going to do, that's what she was supposed to do. And I think it's quite remarkable at what Zelig did here. He defied the odds by doing this. You're not supposed to take photos, you're not supposed to keep the photos. So this to me is sort of an act of resistance in keeping who you are in the midst of the Nazis or the Holocaust just taking everything away from you. My grandmother lived in the ghetto for 3 years. When I think about her story, oh, that's my grandfather, everyone. That's my grandfather. So they lived in the ghetto for 3 years. So I think a lot of her time that she remembers from 7 to 10 was her time in the ghetto. I think she remembers that time the most because then she moved around a lot. And, they made sort of the best they could of life for themselves. They lived in a small apartment. They had some aunts and uncles that lived with them. They had a cook and a nanny that came along. And I think Zelig was probably paying these people to help their lives a bit. And, at one point they talk about they didn't have food and Zelig would barter anything that he could to get, if it was jewelry or whatever he could. So he was useful to the Germans during the Holocaust. Because he was a photographer, the Germans were very proud and they wanted photos of themselves. And he was doing really progressive and advanced work. He had a 3D camera, in 1930s, that wasn't very common. And he was taking photographs and putting them on porcelain plates, which I'm sure you guys have seen before, but back then that wasn't a common thing. So he was really advanced. And so the Nazis used him and his talents for their own usage. And that's what kept them alive. He was useful to the Germans. He knew how to make himself useful. And as a result, he was like, please protect my family. Please don't touch my family. So in theory, my grandmother and all her siblings and her parents were safe, whatever that means. They were sort of like left untouched for as long as they could have been. One day in 1942, so there used to be active roundups of the Jews, and they used to round up the Jews and like send them away. Towards the end of their time at the ghetto, in 1942 in October, there was a roundup. And Zelig and Gittel, the parents, were like, you guys need to hide, you guys need to hide. They went to a couple places, all the hiding spots were full. They went to a neighbor's house and they hid in the attic. So here's an example of this is unoriginal. This is an example of what the attic looked like. It was described like you couldn't stand, you had to crawl. There was already so many people in there. They shoved my grandmother, her sister, and her brother. And Menachem, her brother, had a cough at the time.
He was asthmatic. He had asthma.
He had asthma. So at the time, he was dealing with a cough. It's also October. It's already cold. They're in Poland. And they're terrified that they're going to get caught because of his cough, that he keeps like coughing. They hear the Nazis downstairs. They hear boots. They hear dogs barking. They hear them banging on, like knocking on the doors to hear like if it's hollow or not, if there were people in there, if there weren't people in there. So Menachem starts coughing. So he says to his sister, throw a rag in my throat and I need you to get on top of me. Everyone was like, you need to stop coughing. Like everyone's terrified, like this guy is going to expose them. So she goes on top of him. They wait a while until they hear nothing. She gets off of him and he's not breathing. She's like, oh my, did I just kill my brother? Like she's terrified that she just killed her brother. She takes the rag out. She starts shaking him. Someone had a little bit of water. They put it, splash on his face, put it on his lips, and he wakes up. I mean, a miracle, right? Like he was willing to almost just do anything just to like not, to save the family, not get caught. So they were terrified by that experience. They stayed in the attic, and their father comes to pick them up. So their father takes them out, and they're like, where's mom? Where's mom? Their mom got rounded up, and all the women in her family were all sent to Treblinka. My grandmother never saw her mom again. This is a picture of my grandmother Esther and her mom Gittel. Gittel at the time was 40 years old, and that was it. Chana, I was just reading a book, and Chana her sister describes like the emptiness and the sadness that they felt at that moment. This was like the first person, they'd been together for 3 years, surviving the war together as best as they could, living through terrible, terrible conditions. And there was like a hopelessness and a helplessness that they felt. She was like, just like, there was a very big shift in like the energy. She just like knew things were very different. And I think it just like the worst of what was happening just sort of like sat with them. Again, like my grandmother was 10 years old, right? Like she was just still so young. Chana was 12. Her brother was 16 at the time. So 2 months, so that was October. 2 months later, it's dead winter, it's December, newfound poverty, they have no food, it's freezing, they don't have like cold, they don't have any warmth. Their father, Zelig, cuts a deal with someone outside. So they lived in the ghetto. They lived near the border of the ghetto. So Chana and Menachem used to like run out and like get food and get little things that they could for the family, whatever they can smuggle in. And we sort of talk about that at the museum, like what a power shift, right? Like typically your parents take care of you and like you look at your parents take care of you. And here in the ghetto or during the Holocaust, like little kids are like taking care of the family. And that sort of changes dynamics of the family. So the two kids would smuggle whatever they could. So one day, Zelig says to his son, I've arranged coal for us. It's freezing. I've arranged some coal from someone outside. You are going to go and get it. And Menachem says, I don't want to go. I just heard gunshots earlier. Like, I'm terrified. I don't want to go tonight. Like, please don't send me. He's like, I already arranged it. This is all on schedule. Like, you need to go. So Menachem, who's 16 years old, and the nanny go out to pick up the coal. They come back past curfew. 2 of them shot dead. That just took their sadness to now a whole nother level. At that point, I think her father felt so much guilt that they describe in the book that like the whole energy, the whole vibe in the house just took like a whole new low. And, this was just 2 months after they lost their mom. So things are becoming, as if it's not real already, like they're losing family members. Like they were a 5-unit intact family, and now like the 2 of them are now, 2 family members are now gone. So because Zelig, her father, had connections with people outside the Germans, people outside the ghetto, people inside the ghetto, he finds out that the ghetto is going to get liquidated. And he arranges for himself and his 2 daughters that are alive to get paperwork. This is an actual document of Zelig. We found Zelig's paperwork with a new identity. So now, after surviving barely 3 years in the ghetto, they now get paperwork. My grandmother's 10. The paperwork now says that she's 14, and she's a Catholic girl, Regina Koszkakowska. Did I say it right? Koszarovska. So she now has a new identity at 10. And her father gives her a Bible and a rosary and was like, this is your new identity. My grandmother's a Jewish girl who speaks Polish, knows some Yiddish, and went to Jewish day school. She knew that this was going to keep her alive. And that was that. She sort of let go of Esther Wilhelm at that time. She was like, that was it. Like, I knew that my identity was now Regina. And that saved her. That actually saved her throughout the whole war. Her sister did the same thing, and so did Zelig. So Zelig arranges, because my grandmother's still so young, she's 10. Chana goes by herself. Chana's like, I'm going to do my own life. I'm going to survive. I'm going to like figure it out. So Chana, her sister, who's just 2 years older, sort of leaves. And it was just like, her father couldn't arrange for like all both girls to be with families. So he couldn't put them together, and he couldn't arrange for families. He arranges for my grandmother Esther to go with a Polish, non-Jewish friend of his. This woman's, her name is Krista Kempa. Her and her mother took my Savta, my grandmother. And honestly, like God bless this woman. Like she and her mom saved my grandmother. And she stayed with her, and a neighbor saw my grandmother and was like, she's new. Like, where'd this girl come from? And she was like, I don't know. Things just seem like weird and fishy. So this neighbor, had a husband who was an SS soldier. She told them, like, explore this new girl in the town. They took my grandmother and her mom, Teresa, for interrogation. They put them in 2 different rooms. And my grandmother talks about this very vividly. She says it was like a torture chamber. She said it was like blood everywhere. Mind you, she's 10 years old. Her paperwork says she's 14. She has a new identity. She's now Catholic, which she like, her mother teaches her Catholicism. And she's like, I'm not Jewish. And they're like really honing in on her, interrogating her. And she's like, I knew in my core at that moment that her mom, Teresa, would never turn on me, because that means she would die, and they were going to kill me. So she says, I knew my story, and I knew how to stick with it. So at one point they leave they kept coming back in and out of the room, and the interrogation room had a little window. And my grandmother sat down and started praying to Jesus and Mary. And she said, Jesus and Mary are going to save me. She's like, I believed it. I sat down and I prayed on my knees, begging and praying, and I believed that they were going to come save me. 2 SS soldiers happened to have seen my grandmother praying. And they're like, what are you doing? She's not Jewish. Look at her. She's on her knees praying. They released her. Things were not comfortable in the town. They were like, we're not safe. We already things seem suspicious. So Teresa moved my grandmother to this monastery, and she was there for a short time. So my mom and my uncle took this photo. Actually, it's still up there till today. And, you know, they also saved my grandmother's life. So they kept her in there for a short time. I think it was like only a couple weeks, because when it was time for my grandmother to pray during prayers, she was late. And they were like, something's weird about her. Like, she had to go down on kneel, and my grandmother was like late to kneeling. And they were like, listen, we don't want anything to do with this. And so they moved her. So my grandmother, still super young, is now moved to Warsaw for a short time to be with her dad, who she now has to call uncle. And he at the time is now living with Krista. So Krista basically drops my grandmother off with her mother and then goes to Zelig. And now they're living in Warsaw. They're all sort of communicating, right? Because it's like all family. So my grandmother for a short time is like with her father, who now she has to call uncle. And she was like, that was so weird. She's like, he's my dad. And I was always scared that I was going to say his name wrong. You know, and my grandmother used to say, like, she was so terrified of sleeping. Like, even in the monastery, she was so scared of sleeping that in the night she would speak. She would say things. She would say things that are in Polish. She would say things that, whatever she was saying. And she was terrified of even like going to bed. She used to talk about that, like speaking in her dreams. She didn't know what she would say. She was always so terrified of it. So she stays with her dad in Warsaw for a very short time. Her sister, Hanna, connects with them and says, come to Austria. Come with me to Vienna. They need labor workers. So Hanna has her own story, and she's like surviving by herself basically, but every so often like tapping in with her dad, like she knows where everyone is. She reconnects with Esther, my grandmother, and the reason there was a labor shortage in Vienna is because Austria was annexed. All the workers are now SS soldiers. And so they need help. They need people. They have farms. Like, they need people to do just manual work. So Hannah says, come with me. I'm working at a farm. I'm going to put Esther, my grandmother, in a farm. So my grandmother works as a laborer in a farm. She's doing milking the cows, working the fields. And the woman sometimes of like who owned the house and the property would sometimes like let my grandmother in. She was also super young at the time. She was like 12 years old. She'd let her in. She really liked her. My grandmother was super charismatic. She had a great personality. She was bubbly. And the woman was like, you can come. And my grandmother was sometimes terrified because she'd be with the woman's boys who were like in the Hitler Youth. So she was like terrified to like be near these people, but like knew like this is her only way to survive. So somehow they go, you know, today it's 6 hours, but back then time was different and cars were different and transportation was different. But it was a little bit of a journey that they went. And so she stayed in Vienna and she worked there and she lived there until they were liberated in 1945. This is a picture of my grandmother with her sister, and they were liberated by the Red Army. And I don't think she could believe it at that time. They were, you know, she'd been through such a rough time. And when the Red Army did liberate the Jews, that wasn't pleasant either, but she was free. She was free. And they eventually made it to, she moved around a bit even after the war, which was even crazier, but she basically reunited with her father. So they didn't know what to do, obviously, but everyone back to their home. Like they were like, let's go back home. So she went back to Radomsko. Her dad opens the door. She sees her dad. They're reunited. She's like, her sister writes in the book, we kissed the ground. We came home and we kissed the ground. We made it home and we were alive. And he was alive. And shortly after, within a couple weeks, the Polish people kicked them out of their home, right? Came with guns and was like, you need to get out of here. So they left, they fled, and they went to her father. So my grandmother now is 13 years old. Her father drops her off at like a children's orphanage, which was really just like an education center. And so she was there for 2 years. He left them and went to a DP camp and was like, I'll come back and pick you guys up, but like, you need to study, you need to learn. I can't provide you education. So he dropped them off for 2 years. He went to Germany. He was part of the DP camp, like the president of the DP camp. He really just sort of like put everyone together. And he went back to pick them up. And she lived with him for a year in the DP camp. And in 1948, she immigrated to Israel. Photos of my grandmother in the army. So she was 16 years old in 1948. And she's always like very proud of this, but she didn't know what to do with herself. And she was like, I'm going to fight in IDF. And so she changed. She had always already been prepared with like changing her age throughout the war. And so she said, I'm 18 years old. She was really 16. And they let her in. She like had false papers, and she was at the war she was at the army at 16 years old. And then 2 years later, when my grandfather at 18 went to the army, she was actually his officer. She like brought him into her unit. They met like as neighbors. These are photos of her on her motorcycle and, driving a truck or Jeep. She's always very proud of what she did at the army, and she had a lot of pride in her identity and who she was and her survival. And, she wanted to be with the men. Like, she was like, I'm no different. Like, I'm gonna, she trained my father on how to drive during the army, like tractors. She was always very proud of that. Many years later, my grandmother got reunited from a couple kids. So this is an original photo of my grandmother while she was in the children's orphanage school. Many years later, she reunited with the same people who also survived. And that was in Israel. And it's quite remarkable. Here's a photo of, so after the war, my grandmother and her sister and her dad, and I don't know who the other person is, went back to their house. So my grandmother used to say she was always like very affluent, came from like a nice family, and I know a lot of survivors all say that, of course. And I always, it seems to be true because my mom went back, and this is the same house, which is now obviously very run down. It's owned by the city, and 3 families live in that house. So they've like made it apartments where my grandmother and just her 5 siblings like lived in that same home. So that's what it looks like in present day. And then this is a original building that was part of the ghetto, and my mom and uncle took that photo. And here's a photo of my grandparents when they got married. And this is a more recent photo at the Holocaust Museum LA Gala. My grandmother always, I just look at that photo of her, both of them, but really my grandmother is just, like, she's very magnetic and she was very vibrant and she lived a very full life, and she didn't let the Holocaust and her story bring her down. She didn't. It was just like it was part of her scarring. And listen, I'm a 3G, I hear it differently. Like if you ask my mom and her siblings, like they may have like a very different experience, not only living with her, but also the stories that she shared with them. I think as a 3G, there's enough distance there that I heard and saw a different grandmother than maybe that they were raised with. And, she really just focused on a full life. Here's a photo of my grandparents, her sister Hannah that survived the war, her husband Hanan, and Zelig. And this is a really amazing photo, which is my grandmother's family that was in Palestine and all the survivors, all the family that survived the war. So out of 68 people of like extended family, aunts and uncles and cousins, 6 survived. So at my grandmother's wedding, the survivors are here, plus my grandmother's aunt and uncles that were in Palestine at the time and weren't part of the war. I threw this photo in because I'm like gonna get emotional again. I wanted to, like my grandmother, I think her revenge was a big family. She was like, you can't take that away from me. And she had 4 kids and 12 grandkids, and she has 6 great-grandchildren. And this is my youngest, my uncle, who's on the board of the museum with me and his wife. That was their wedding, obviously. Yeah, that's me. So we have such a bigger family now, because this was 25 years ago. But I think her revenge was a big, big family. And that's what she did. She was so proud of all of us, and she really was she carried so much pride in who she was and who her family was. This is a photo of me and my grandmother. at the gala. And here's a photo of my mom and my grandmother. The last thing I really want to say is, you know, if I think about my grandmother's message, for someone that had gone through the worst atrocities, she never hated, and we were not allowed to use the word hate. It was like forbidden. And she said, instead of using the word hate, you have to use another 4-letter word, love. And she loved, she really did. Like, she was very open. She cared for people. She loved people. She always shared that she loved everyone. And I think that's partly because non-Jews saved her. Like, there was also good people, right? Like, not everyone during the Holocaust was bad. And I think she saw the goodness in people, and she wanted to see the goodness in people. And she had a really special, beautiful heart that was very open and quite accepting. And I just think that's such a powerful message for someone that went through so much. And it was really important. I mean, like, you all are here, and I'm so blessed to be doing this. If she was here, she'd kick me off stage and would love to just share her story herself to all of you guys. She loved sharing, and she loved talking, and she loved an audience, and she lived a really vibrant life. And I think as her, I see my family here, I think we all try to, like, take a piece of that as we start our own lives or have our own lives, and remember, like, who she was and the fighter that she was. And the, you know, she really was a fighter all the way till the end, till her very last breath. She fought all the way through. Okay, well, anyway, that's my story.
I couldn't be any prouder of Galit. I mean, when my mom and I were kind of thinking how to get Galit involved in a museum, I said to my mother, go ask Galit, because Galit is going to do it, because at the time, I couldn't do it. When my mom was alive, I couldn't tell her story. Every time I would talk to her and she said the story, I saw the pain. So I could not really tell her story. And so I knew that my mom needs to find somebody younger and a granddaughter. And Galit was just looking at what to do and what to get involved. And she was in high school. And I said to my mom, this is a good one. Just get Galit to do this. But you remember, I'm very close, first of all. I'm very close to my mom. I was very close to my mom. My mom was my hero. And even now that she's not here, you know, I miss her every day and I think about her every day. But to do this program and to go over what she did and how they survived, it just doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense. And that's why we do the story. We want to do the story because we want to teach people about what happened to her so they can connect and have a deeper understanding about the Holocaust. And I'm very proud of Galit. I'm just thinking, how am I going to top it off? And I'm going to tell the story, because I'm going to tell the story as well. And my mom started to wanted to share more of her story. When we moved to Los Angeles, she started to have the need to tell her story, because she realized that if she's not going to tell the story, how people are going to know the story. My mom was crazy about my dad. My dad is 91 years old, and he's
Mr. Tepper.
Mr. Tepper. And my mom was crazy about him, and crazy about the life that she built with him and our family. And I just wanted my dad to come, even if he's not best of health. I said, you know, my dad has to be here. I don't know what he recognized my mom, I'm sure. But that's why he's here. I needed to say that. Listen to the story. Look, everybody here came to hear the story. I just want to honor Galit for doing that. So.
Nice.
How did you get all these pictures? Because
Like, for example, the ones in the ghetto that he wasn't supposed to take, yet he took them. How did he develop them? Where did the album go? How did you get a hold of them? And all the other photos as well.
Great question. I just asked my mom the same thing.
Few people in Israel. There's, the Aunt Hinda, and there's also another brother and three sisters who moved to Israel in 1925. So they were sending photos to Israel. So I believe that that's how we have so many photos.
And then the ones in the ghetto, I want to say, oh,
This is my brother.
I can speak. I don't need a microphone. So I'm Gil. I'm Galit's uncle, Bati's brother. My dad's there, and my mom's a survivor. You walk in, it says you can't lift the village by yourself. It takes a village. But my mom, a part of her personality was documentation. She has an unbelievable collection of photos that she's always paid attention to. So the photos before my grandfather passed away, he had a photography studio. It wasn't a 3D camera. He had a regular camera, but he had a technique to develop it, and he actually invented one of the early 3D visualization techniques, and it was in his studio. I remember it as a child, going from Tel Aviv to Haifa, and one of the treats was to sit in front of this machine where you would look at regular photos in 3D.
there's 3 photos. There's 2 here, and I have 1 more. And I think Zelig smuggled them out. There's another photo. It's actually hard to look at. And the Nazis asked him to just destroy it, of course. They were like not showing this, but it's a photo. I actually just gave it to the museum. It's a photo of Jewish people being hung. And a couple German soldiers. And he captured that. They asked him to take the photo. They also asked him to destroy everything or hand over the negatives and everything, and he smuggled that out with him. So I don't have that photo here. The museum will feature it in the ghetto, I think Gallery 4. But it's a really hard photo to look at, and he sort of took that like this is evidence, like this isn't going in the trash, like this is like I'm taking this. So those are only 3. I don't know if there's even more than that, but that's the 3 that we have, and I think he just smuggled them out, or at least the negatives, and then we got this developed.
The stunning hypocrisy of the Nazis to, Jews were the vermin of the earth, and then to use your grandfather for their purposes is just, the hypocrisy is stunning.
I'm sure Beth can talk more about that, or I'm throwing it to Beth, or any docent here, but they talk about, right, like them wanting to capture and document sort of what they were doing. During our program, a few people did some research and found like a lot of documentation of just like, actually Marilyn's, I don't even know if you know this, Marilyn, but your son was in the class with me, and Andy, her son, found a document that showed her father and her 2 brothers, his 2 brothers, all in the same camp. I think like they were like
The numbers are.
and their numbers and like the day that they entered or something. Like it was very detailed, and it showed like their 3 brothers, like where they were. Like there was a lot of documentation. Her son actually found some paperwork, which is really interesting. Because we don't have documentation, we only have a little bit, but we have photos. So you hold on to whatever you can get when you're putting this together.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
So thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
You.
Yes.
How did y'all get or find the letter that they never received?
So there was her sister Hannah documented everything, like after the war, and she actually gave a ton to Yad Vashem. And so the reason we know that they never actually received this letter is because there was also a return to sender. And so that's how we know they never received it. They also received the return to sender. And so I think that's how they kept that. That's how the family got this letter. And then after years later, Hannah went back, my grandmother's sister went back to document and sort of trace what she went through. and collected everything that she could. And then so we just found it on Yad Vashem's website, actually. Like, she turned over a ton of different documents to them. Yeah. I think we're done.
Well, thank you so much.
If anyone has any other questions, Beth is coming up real quickly. She's the CEO and executive director of the museum.
I just want to say that I know Esther is actually in the room with us right now. I feel her presence, and she is so proud of you. And the museum is so proud of you. And like, this is a pivotal moment, as Galit said earlier, and I feel the same way. I grew up hearing my grandparents' stories, and it wasn't until I started getting involved with the museum and I learned the facts, and I realized, and that's when it even hits you harder, and you realize, how did my grandparents survive this, knowing what I know now? So, you know, going through the program and then having all this information and being able to tell it in a way that is so meaningful for, you know, future generations to understand this history. It's so important to learn these lessons, and thank you for being the first for us. I'm truly so proud. And I know your grandmother is so proud. Thank you everyone for being here for our very first 3G talk. And there are more to come. So we hope that you'll check our schedule on the website, because we're going to be doing these more frequently. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. And thank you, Bhakti, for me.